Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClaire, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. I am going to tell you about a thing the South has been trying to forget for more than 200 years, and has never quite managed to bury. Down here, people are generous with their ghosts. They will hand you stories about pirates and old voodoo queens and plantations full of restless dead as easy as pouring you a drink. Most of those tales soften when the sun comes up. This one does not. The Rougarou belongs to that small, ugly handful of legends that make even hard men clear their throat and change the subject when the wind shifts. You might have heard the name somewhere, tossed around on a ghost tour, or stuck on a Halloween decoration, turned into something safe enough to sell. Folks up north say it like it is a costume, like it never meant anything more dangerous than plastic fangs and a rubber mask. Down here along the bayous of South Louisiana, people know better. They may roll their eyes and pretend the old stories are foolishness, yet they still check the locks when the fog gets thick and the dogs start whining at a door that shows nothing but night. Nobody wastes fear on a story that never earned it. I grew up with the Rougarou the way other children grew up with bedtime prayers. The old folks did not ask whether I believed. They assumed I did, the same way they assumed the river would rise in spring and hurricane season would come no matter how blue the sky looked in June. They said there are two ways to meet the Rougarou. One is as a curse, the other as a creature. The curse belongs to the church, or at least to the way people bent the church to fit their fear. The creature belongs to the swamp, and the swamp does not care what any priest thinks about it. On Sundays, the priest would stand at the altar and talk about sin and duty and the holy days that needed keeping. For most people, that sounded like rules and guilt and the weight of heaven. For the Cajun families scattered along the marsh, it sounded like survival. Lent was the serious one. 40 days and nights meant to be offered up clean, no meat, no dancing, no foolishness. Break that promise, the elders said, and the Lord would not be the one coming for you first. The Rougarou would smell your failure like blood in the water and take your shape for 101 nights. You would walk as the thing you feared, hunting the people you loved, too far gone to stop yourself. That was one side of it, the Catholic side, the version that wrapped the beast in scripture the way moss wraps a live oak. The other side ran older and wilder. Long before anyone built a chapel on this soil, the French carried with them tales of the Loup-garou, the wolf man that lurked at the edge of the village. When those exiles were pushed south into this wet, tangled country, the forest turned to cypress stands, and the cold wind turned to heavy, strangling heat. The monster changed clothes, but not its nature. It traded snow and dark pine for mangroves and brackish water, and learned how to move, without leaving a ripple. To the farmers and fishermen and trappers carving out a life in the marsh, the Rougarou became something more than a sermon prop. Cattle went missing with no prints in the mud. Nets came up torn from something too strong and too smart to be an ordinary gator. A cousin stumbled home at dawn with eyes that did not look like his own, unable to say where he had been all night, shivering, even though the air was thick and hot as breath. People started to say that some nights the swamp lent its hunger to a human body and sent it walking. Over time, the two stories twisted together, curse and creature braided so tight nobody could say where one ended and the other began. The old women would cross themselves and say the beast came for those who took their faith lightly. The men cleaning their rifles at the kitchen table would say a gun never hurt a ghost and never failed to slow down flesh and bone. Everybody agreed on one thing. Once the Rougarou set its eye on you, whether as punishment or prey, the only sure protection was to keep your word and keep your distance from the places the land itself seemed reluctant to touch. A lot of legends stay vague. They float above the ground, never tied to a single year or name. That is how you can tell when something is just a story. The Rougarou has dates attached to it. It has parishes and surnames and quiet entries in old French newspapers that never use the word directly, yet describe things no ordinary animal could do. It has hunters who disappeared, boats found drifting with fresh blood on the boards, children who came back from the edge of the marsh with scratches they could not explain, and a silence in their eyes that did not belong to childhood. There are people still living who will not say what they saw between the cane fields and the water line. not because they fear being laughed at, though that happens often enough, but because they are convinced that speaking its name with too much detail is an invitation. They say the Rougarou lives off attention as much as fear. Feed it second-hand through gossip and jokes, and it might stay content in the stories. Name the things it has done in full. Talk about the smell of its breath and the way its shadow bends wrong against the trees, and you risk waking something that prefers to do its work unannounced. You can stand in a city and pretend the world is solid and safe. Pretend that there is nothing left on this continent that cannot be mapped and named and reduced to a documentary. The minute you step off asphalt and into a Louisiana marsh at night, that certainty starts to leak away. The land here is not firm. It shifts under your boots, gives back echoes you did not ask for. The water holds more secrets than it does fish. A place like that does not need help being dangerous. Yet the people who settled here still invented a monster because the ordinary weight of risk was not enough to explain what kept happening. So when I sit here and tell you about the Rougarou, I am not handing you a simple campfire horror story. I am handing you a map of the way fear, faith, and landscape got braided together in the hearts of Cajun folk until they could not separate sin from swamp or conscience from creature. The Rougarou is the shape that guilt takes when a community believes the Lord is watching, but the dark is watching closer. It is also, if you listen to the right family histories, something that has appeared in the corner of more than one lantern circle, eyes burning a color that did not belong to any known animal. In the nights to come, I will walk you through one particular tangle of those histories, because that is the only way to make sense of it. There was a family out along Bayou Piquant who kept their Lent every year without fail, not out of devotion but out of raw, hard fear. There was a young man who decided the rules no longer applied to him, that he was too clever and too modern for the old ways. There was a priest who said the Rougarou was nothing more than a superstition, and then begged for a transfer after something scratched his door 3 times at midnight and left no mark the next morning but the smell of wet fur. Their stories crossed in a single season when the water ran unusually low and the fog came in earlier than it had in years. The elders said the swamp was making room for something, clearing its throat. Livestock went restless. Dogs refused to step off the porch. Children started waking from dreams they could not describe, shaking and unable to stop staring at the tree line. The kind of slow, creeping pattern that makes no sense when you look at each piece but feels undeniable when you stand back and trace the line between them all. That season began like any other, with ashes smudged on foreheads and a priest reminding his flock that promises made to heaven were not to be taken lightly. By the time those 40 days were finished, there would be more than one person in that parish wondering whether the church had been warning them about the wrong thing. The punishment they feared did not come from the sky. It came from the water and the dark, carrying an old French name and a hunger nobody could rightly explain. That is the story you are about to hear. Not a fable for children, not a clean morality tale tied up with a ribbon, but a piece of Cajun memory that still walks on 4 legs in the imagination of anyone who has ever stood alone on a Louisiana back road and felt the hairs on their arms lift for no good reason. The Rougarou is not interested in whether you believe in it. It is interested in whether you remember that some promises carry teeth. Now that you know the shape of the fear, we can move from the wide shadow down into the narrow path where this particular tale begins, with a boy, a broken vow, and a stretch of bayou that would never be called quiet again. The story began with a boy whose life should have been as simple as the tide rolling in and out of the marsh. His name was Etienne LeBlanc, born to a long line of shrimpers and cane cutters who had built their houses on stilts and their faith on fear of things they could not see. His family lived near the banks of Bayou Piquant, a stretch of waterway so still in summer that it reflected the moon like a polished blade. The LeBlancs were not wealthy, but they had something more reliable than money. They had rules. Rules older than roads, passed down from Acadian ancestors who had fled one cold land, only to find another kind of danger hiding in the heat. Etienne was 17 the year everything shifted. Too old to be a child, too stubborn to be a man. He grew tall and lean the way boys do when they spend more time balancing in pirogues than sitting at desks. His hair always smelled faintly of cypress smoke, and his hands carried the nicks of someone who never walked away from work that needed doing. He was quick, restless, and hungry for a life that did not look like the Prosecs, one his father and grandfather had lived. Those men were carved from the same hard wood, steady and silent, never questioning the things they were told. Etienne wanted something different. He wanted the freedom to ignore old superstitions and decide for himself what was worth fearing. For years he had listened to the elders talk about the Rougarou as if it were a neighbor who might knock at any hour. They spoke of the beast in quiet tones, turning their eyes toward the water with a mixture of resentment and respect. To Etienne, it sounded like a story meant to keep children obedient and grown men in line, a shape conjured by boredom and humidity, born from nights too long and imaginations too sharp. He told himself that a world with radios and electrified fences had no room for monsters made from old French syllables and Catholic guilt. He believed that until the year he tried to outrun a promise. Lent arrived that spring with an unusual heaviness. The air felt thick even in February, carrying the weight of storms the Gulf had not yet decided to throw. The elders noticed it first. Birds flew lower along the bayou. Turtles that normally sunned on logs retreated back into the water. Even the mosquitoes, relentless as they were, seemed quieter. The people in Etienne's parish said the swamp was waiting for something, and nothing that makes the swamp wait is small. On Ash Wednesday, the church filled before sunrise. Families filed in, heads bowed, carrying the solemn silence of people accustomed to sacrifice. The priest, Father Melanchon, spoke with a gravity that pulled the whole room in. He warned them that promises made now needed to be honored, that breaking a Lenten vow was not merely a matter between man and God, but a matter between man and the land he lived on. He did not say the Rougarou by name, but everyone heard it in the pause between his words, the way the old stories pressed against the back of the congregation's thoughts, like a draft slipping through a moof. Crack. Etienne sat near the back with his friends, restless and impatient. He was tired of being warned about the same thing, year after year. His father nudged him once, gently, as if reminding him that tradition did not require belief, only respect. Etienne nodded but felt no weight behind it. He planned to follow Lent as he always had, giving up small comforts without much conviction, just enough to satisfy his mother and avoid the disappointed silence his father used as punishment. Everything changed 2 weeks in, when a group of older boys from a neighboring parish invited him to a gathering out by the abandoned sugar mill. It was the kind of place the church frowned upon, where rusted machinery and tall grass hid the activities of teenagers searching for trouble. They promised music, strong drink, and the company of girls who lived too far upriver to worry about gossip traveling quickly. Etienne hesitated at first, remembering the vow he had made at the altar. But the desire to shake loose the suffocating expectation of obedience won. His friends urged him on, calling him cautious in a tone that felt more like an insult than a safety warning. Etienne knew better, but 17-year-old pride has its own gravity. He followed them, ignoring the old rule that said the worst decisions begin in places where the light does not reach. That night the moon was thin and the air unnaturally warm. The abandoned mill sat like a skeleton in the clearing, its metal ribs exposed and its floor swallowed by weeds. Lanterns swung from rusted beams, throwing unsteady shadows across the ground. Someone had brought homemade liquor, sharp enough to pull tears from a grown man's eyes. Girls laughed in clusters near the open door. Music drifted from a cracked radio, its static blending with the hum of insects. Nobody spoke of Lent. Nobody cared. Etienne drank more than he intended. He felt light, reckless, and grateful to be away from the suffocating expectations of the older generation. He danced, shouted, and pretended the rules of the parish were miles behind him. Yet beneath the noise, something unsettled crept along the edges of his awareness. The swamp pressed close around the mill, the dark tree line standing like a silent crowd. Every so often the music would dip and the group would fall strangely quiet, listening to a rustle that did not belong to wind or small animals. The girls whispered that the woods were too still. The boys brushed it off with bravado they didn't fully believe. Near midnight, a mist rolled in from the bayou, low and slow, curling between the cypress knees like fingers searching for something familiar. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that does not belong to weather. It moved through the crowd unnoticed at first, then with a whisper of unease traveling from person to person. The lanterns flickered but did not go out. The night insects fell silent. Etienne stepped outside to catch his breath, the liquor warm in his blood, his head buzzing with arrogance. As he stood facing the tree line, the mist parted for a moment like it had been pushed aside. The shadow that passed behind it was wrong. Too tall for a man. Too fluid for an animal. Etienne blinked hard, rubbing the sweat from his eyes, telling himself it was drink and darkness mixing together to fool him. But deep in his stomach, something shifted. A cold coil of memory wound tight with every childhood warning he had shrugged off. He returned to the mill unsteady, blaming the strange feeling on exhaustion. The others continued drinking until the lantern flames dimmed and the laughter gave out. By the time the party broke up, the fog covered the ground thick as wool. The boys walked in a group, using their flashlights to cut through the white curtain. Etienne trailed behind them, uneasy for reasons he could not name. Halfway home, they heard something move in the marsh grass, a heavy drag, followed by a sound that was not a growl but carried the shape of one. The boys froze. Etienne felt his heartbeat echo in his teeth. Nobody said anything. They simply walked faster, then faster still, until the dirt path emerged and the fog began to thin. When he reached his door, Etienne did not look back. The next morning his head pounded and his throat burned. But the worst discomfort sat deeper. His mother moved around him with the tight silence of someone who has recognized disappointment. His father stared at him longer than usual before heading out to tend the traps. Etienne tried to shrug it off, tried to pretend the night had left no mark on him, but his body disagreed. A shiver ran up his spine despite the humidity. His hands trembled without cause. When he washed his face that afternoon, he noticed the skin around his eyes had darkened, not with exhaustion but with something more hollow, as if he had left part of himself in the fog. The elders always said the Rougarou chose its victims the way the swamp chose who drowned and who lived. Quietly, without explanation, with no regard for fairness. A broken vow did not summon it. A broken vow simply made the body easier for it to reach. And sometimes it reached before a man even knew he was in danger. Etienne passed the next 2 days trying to forget the strange heaviness that followed him. His sleep turned restless. He woke hungry in a way that food could not fix. He drifted through the parish with the uneasy feeling that he was being watched even in open daylight. When he crossed paths with the priest, Father Melancon paused, studying him with an expression that seemed almost frightened. The old man muttered a blessing under his breath and moved on. Etienne felt the air around him tighten. By the third night, the transformation began, though he did not yet understand what was happening. He woke before dawn to find the sheets tangled around him like restraints. His muscles ached as if he had been running for miles. Dirt streaked his feet. A raw taste of metal lingered on. His tongue. He searched his memory for what he might have done in his sleep, but nothing came. His mind felt split, part of it drifting just behind him like a second shadow. His mother noticed the change before he did. She watched him from the doorway as he ate, as if she were waiting for him to disappear between one breath and the next. Her hands trembled when she crossed herself. She asked if he had kept his Lenten vow. His silence answered her. The old stories said the first sign of the Rougarou's claim was not physical. It was the way animals reacted. Dogs howled in the night without cause. Cattle pressed themselves against fences, as if trying to escape an invisible danger. Birds refused to settle in the branches above the house. By the end of that week, all those things had come to pass. The parish began to whisper. The priest began to pray. And Etienne LeBlanc began to understand that some promises do not break clean. They break wide open. He tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself that exhaustion and guilt had twisted into superstition. But each night the fog returned earlier, crawling up from the water as if called. Each night his memory split further, leaving him with only fragments of where he had been. A torn piece of fabric stuck to a cypress stump, mud under his nails, scratches on his arms that stung with a heat that did not belong to any wound he recognized. By the end of the second week, the parish avoided him, stepping aside in silence when he walked through town. Children hid behind their mothers. The elders watched him with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. They had seen this path before. It never led any place good. Etienne did not yet know it, but the swamp had chosen him, and somewhere between the marsh grass and the tree line, something that remembered hunger better than mercy had begun to wake. The parish kept an unofficial calendar that had nothing to do with saints' feast days or harvest seasons. People measured time by the behavior of the swamp, by the way the wind sounded in the palmettos, by how early the fog rose and how long it lingered. Every family along Bayou Piquant had learned to read these signs the way other regions read storm clouds. When the land shifted, even a little, the locals tightened their routines and prepared for what might follow. By the time Etienne LeBlanc's third week of Lent arrived, the entire region had started paying attention. The bayou water, usually a dull greenish-brown that reflected whatever sky hung above it, had taken on an odd stillness. Even with boats cutting along its surface and turtles climbing onto half-submerged logs, the water refused to ripple in its usual patterns. It lay flat and cold under the sun, behaving like something watching instead of something moved by wind. People commented on it in passing, never loudly, but with the heaviness that followed any sign of imbalance. The swamp only grew quiet when it was listening. Etienne noticed these changes in pieces, never fully understanding them until they converged all at once. He tried to move through the days as if nothing had changed, working alongside his father on the traps and checking the nets at dawn. Yet everything he touched seemed wrong. The lines tangled, the boats leaned, even the oars refused to catch water the same way. He felt a strange distance from his own hands, a disconnection that grew worse as the sun dipped each night. His father sensed it long before anyone said it aloud. The man had lived his entire life on this water, and his instincts rang louder than any sermon. He watched the boy struggle to tie a knot he had mastered at 10 years old. He watched him forget the family rhythms, wander off without realizing, stare into the tree line for minutes at a time with a focus that resembled hunger more than curiosity. The elder LeBlanc said nothing, because nothing worth saying existed. Words could not undo whatever had already been set in motion. He did not scold. He did not comfort. He simply worked beside his son and waited, the way the old people had always waited when the swamp chose its next target. Around this time, livestock across the parish began acting strange. Horses refused to enter their stalls after dusk. Chickens huddled in tight clusters instead of settling onto their roosts. Several families reported hearing something walking the banks of their property at night, not fast, not clumsy, but deliberate. Whatever it was, did not break branches or splash through water. It moved as if it lived in the silence rather than passing through it. Some said it sounded as though the swamp itself had grown legs and taken to traveling in the dark. People avoided naming these disturbances, fearing that recognition would make them worse. They called it heavy weather. They blamed wandering gators. They blamed the season. But privately, in kitchens lit by single lamps and screened porches that faced the marsh, the whispers grew. A promise had been broken. A boy had invited something old and hungry to take interest. On the fourth night after Etienne's first strange waking, the dogs began to howl shortly after sunset. It was not the wild, scattered noise they made when chasing one another or sensing a passing raccoon. This sound rolled out of them in long, trembling notes, as if pulled from the deepest part of their lungs by something they could not resist. The howls came from every direction. Houses separated by miles echoed with the same mournful cry. No one opened a door to check. No one dared. Etienne lay awake through it, staring at the ceiling while a pulse beat in his jaw. His skin felt tight, too warm, but sweat refused to rise. He tried to breathe evenly, but each inhale scraped his ribs. He heard the howling. He felt it trace something familiar deep inside him. A strange satisfaction flickered behind his breastbone, neither welcome nor understood. When the noise finally died near midnight, the silence that followed carried a weight heavier than any storm. The next morning he discovered a trail of dried mud from his bed to the back door. His feet ached as if he had walked miles. His fingernails had grown jagged along the edges, catching on the sheets. His eyes, usually a warm brown, reflected a dull amber when caught by the morning light. He tried to ignore these details, but the truth pressed in from all sides, like humidity before a storm. By then, people no longer passed him on the road of their own will. They stepped aside with a respectful distance, keeping their children behind them as if the boy carried a sickness that could leap from skin to skin. Etienne noticed the way conversations fell away when he approached. He felt the weight of their eyes on his back as he walked away. He saw how lanterns burned longer at night along the edges of the houses nearest the swamp, as though villagers hoped the light would push the creeping darkness back a little farther. On the seventh day, the first real sign appeared. The parish kept a herd of cattle along the ridge beyond the cane fields. These animals were valuable, handled carefully and checked each morning. That week, the herders found 2 of them separated from the group, standing stiff near the edge of the brush. Their hides carried scratches deep enough to draw blood, but arranged in a pattern no one could interpret. Not the broad swipes of a panicked gator. Not the circular marks of a wildcat. These were narrow, long, and strangely even, as if left by something that understood the shape of flesh. The herders told themselves it must have been a feral hog. But none of the men truly believed it. They had hunted and cleaned enough hogs to know the difference. The animals' eyes told the story better than the wounds. Both cattle stared in the same direction, unblinking, toward the line where the fog usually rose. Their breathing came in sharp, silent bursts. The men said nothing more and moved the herd closer to town. The priest tried to calm the parish with talk of vigilance and prayer. But his own face betrayed him. Father Melancon carried himself differently in those days, walking faster between the rectory and the chapel, lighting more candles than usual. He prayed at odd hours, tracing the stations of the cross with a trembling hand. Once, just after dusk, he passed Etienne on the church steps and froze, unable to continue down the path until the boy had gone. His eyes were filled not with anger but with sorrow. The kind of sorrow that came from recognizing a burden too old and too heavy to lift. Etienne's mother watched him with a fear she tried not to show. She moved quietly through the house, placing small religious tokens near windows and door frames. Objects handed down through her mother's mother, and blessed by a priest so far back that his name had been swallowed by time. She did not confront her son or scold him for his broken Lenten vow. The truth had outgrown correction. Her silence was not judgment, it was mourning. The change inside Etienne grew stronger each night. His senses sharpened in ways that made the world seem too loud, too bright, too animate. The sound of water dripping from a roof became a drumbeat in his skull. The scent of pine resin carried a sweetness that bordered on intoxicating. The distant hum of insects vibrated against the back of his teeth. He could hear footsteps from clear across the yard. He could smell the difference between fear and sweat on the people who passed him. Worst of all, hunger began to gnaw at him in a way no meal could satisfy. Ordinary food tasted dull, muted. He chewed without appetite, swallowing because habit demanded it, not because his body agreed. At night, the hunger sharpened into something almost electric, pulling him toward the darker parts of the swamp with a force he struggled to resist. He would lie awake on his back, fingers curled around the sheets, fighting the urge to stand and walk into the bent tree line as if answering a summons. On the 10th night, the urge overcame him. He woke the next morning with dirt caked beneath his fingernails, dried blood smeared across his forearms, and half-remembered images clinging to his thoughts like wet leaves. Trees rushing past him, water splashing underfoot, a shape moving alongside him with animal grace, a scent of iron and earth filling his lungs. He staggered out of bed, dizzy, and caught sight of himself in the small mirror hanging above the wash basin. His pupils had thinned. The color around them had deepened into something closer to molten gold. He turned away from the mirror and felt a tightening in his chest, a violent thrum that pulsed in time with a rhythm he could not ignore. Part of him wanted to run. Another part wanted to hide. A deeper part, one that no longer felt entirely human, wanted to return to the place where the night had swallowed him. By sunrise, the parish learned of the missing hounds. 3 families kept, hunting dogs near the woods, loyal animals trained to track deer and drive off predators. That morning the kennels stood broken open. The chains hung, snapped, twisted in ways no tool could replicate. The ground bore depressions too large for any wolf and too narrow for any bear. Only one hound was found alive, trembling under a porch, its fur matted and its eyes wild. It refused food, refused water, refused to come out even when called by its owner. People whispered that the dog had seen something that broke whatever part of an animal keeps it brave. Etienne walked past the yard where the kennels once stood and felt a cold flutter beneath his ribs. The scent along the broken wood smelled familiar to him, painfully so. But he could not admit it even to himself. His breath grew shallow. The air tasted metallic. He hurried back toward home, hoping the feeling would pass, but it clung to him for the rest of the day. The parish grew smaller around him. Doors closed earlier. Lamps burned, longer. Families began to gather in tight circles, speaking in low tones, measuring their words carefully. The elders knew what was coming, even before the children sensed the fear. The old way of naming it rose in their thoughts like a memory. A vow broken, a season cursed, a boy marked by something far older than sin. Etienne's father finally spoke to him that night, not with anger but with resignation. The man placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder and looked at him as if trying to memorize the face before it changed again. He did not speak of punishment or forgiveness. He did not ask why Etienne had broken his vow. He simply stood there, steady as an oak, carrying the sorrow of a man who had lived long enough to see this pattern unfold before. The swamp had taken notice. The curse had its foothold. The creature had begun to wake inside the boy's skin. And the next full dark would show the parish of Bayou Piquant what it meant to live in a place where old legends were not stories at all, but warnings carved into blood, soil, and breath. Etienne had become the center of a storm no one could pray away, and the Rougarou, whether curse or creature, had only just begun. The days that followed settled over Bayou Piquant like a film of ash. Every hour felt heavier than the one before, as if the entire landscape had begun holding its breath. People moved slower. Birds kept to the deeper parts of the marsh. Even the air carried a faint copper tang that no one could fully explain. The season had shifted into that strange in-between state where the sun shone bright over water that no longer reflected warmth. Something had taken hold beneath the surface of the parish's ordinary life, stretching itself through the quiet spaces, gathering strength where no one could see it. Everyone felt it, even if no one named it aloud. Etienne tried to behave as if he were unaffected, but the changes inside him were becoming impossible to dismiss. His mind drifted in and out of clarity, sometimes sharp as a knife point, other times muddled like river mud stirred by a heavy storm. His sleep grew shorter and more violent. He woke each morning exhausted, muscles aching in places that suggested long hours of intense movement, though he remembered nothing except flashes, trees whipping past him, water slapping his shins, the sound of something breathing close to his ear, matching his pace as if running beside him. His appetite changed completely. Meals he had once devoured now tasted flat and chalky. Bread felt like dust. Meat tasted cold, even straight off the skillet. Only raw scents, earth, moss, iron, wet bark stirred anything inside him. He caught himself inhaling the air with an intensity that alarmed him. His mother noticed. She watched him without speaking, her eyes full of a pain that had no place to rest. Neighbors who had known Etienne since he was a child began to cross the road when they saw him approaching. They did not run, but they did not linger. Mothers pulled their young ones closer. Men kept their hands loose at their sides, not threatening but prepared. Everyone understood the old stories the same way they understood the shifting of the tides. A boy who wandered the marsh at night without memory was not a boy for long. Something else had begun to walk in his skin. But the most telling sign came the week before the fog thickened to its worst. On the western edge of the parish lived a trapper named Harlan Desjardins, a man known for being cautious to the point of superstition. He set traps only where his father and grandfather had set them, in a narrow corridor of marshland that produced steady catches and no surprises. One morning Harlan found every trap overturned. Not sprung, overturned, bent, almost flat in the center, as if crushed by a force that understood exactly where to apply pressure. The ground around them bore no paw prints or hoof marks, only a pattern of deep indentations that suggested weight but not shape. Harlan told no one at first. He simply moved the traps closer to the house, muttering to himself as he walked. But 2 nights later he woke to the sound of something pacing behind the shed. The rhythm of the steps was wrong for a man, too heavy for a raccoon, too controlled for a feral hog. He stayed inside with his rifle and waited until dawn. When he finally checked the yard, the ground was disturbed in long, curling trails as if something had circled the shed again and again, each round tighter than the last. By sunrise, Harlan had gone into town, pale and silent, to speak with Father Melancon. After that visit, the priest doubled the candles near the altar and began fasting 3 days at a time. No one had to ask why. Etienne's father kept watch over his son at night, sitting awake long after his wife had gone to bed. He took a chair by the back door and listened for the faint creak of floorboards that might signal Etienne slipping out. The boy's restlessness grew so intense that even in sleep he twitched and strained as though caught in a net. The father could see it happening, the slow, inevitable shift that had marked others generations before. The old stories were not abstract to him. His own grandfather had known a boy who succumbed to the same transformation. The parish had never spoken of it again except in whispers. But the memory lived in the bloodline. On the 12th night of the season, the fog returned in a way no one could recall seeing in decades. It rose not from the surface of the water but from within the trees, rolling outward with a purpose, filling the parish like breath filling a lung. It swallowed the dirt paths, drifted up to the window sills of houses, and climbed the stilts beneath porches. Lamps flickered inside homes, their light swallowed as if absorbed by something hungry. People stayed inside with their locks latched. Dogs refused to bark. The night insects, the constant background noise of the south, fell silent, creating an unnatural stillness that made every heartbeat feel louder. Those who had lived through storms, plagues, and tragedies all said the same thing afterward. The fog felt like recognition. Etienne stood near his window, staring out at the shifting white curtain, his breath shallow, his chest tight. He felt the pull begin again, that familiar tightening inside his ribs, as if a cord were wrapped around his lungs and tightening with each passing second. His skin prickled, his jaw ached, his hands flexed without command, sharp pain racing down into his fingertips. Something inside him had been waiting for this exact moment, and now that it had arrived, the part of him that remained human felt like a guest inside his own flesh. He tried to steady himself. He tried to breathe evenly. He told his body to stay still. But instinct had begun to eclipse instruction. His vision blurred at the edges, sounds sharpened into unnatural detail. He heard things he should not have been able to hear. The rustle of reeds half a mile away, the soft scrape of a turtle slipping into water, the pulse of his mother's heartbeat through the wall. The layering of these sounds overwhelmed him, drowned out the rational parts of his mind, and drew him toward the door like a tide pulling a body out to sea. Etienne's father, who had been dozing lightly in the kitchen, sensed the movement even before he saw the shadow pass the doorway. He stood quickly and reached for his son, but Etienne was already halfway out the door, moving with a swiftness no exhausted 17-year-old should possess. The father followed, calling the boy's name in a voice that held no anger, only desperation, but the fog absorbed the sound almost instantly. By the time he reached the yard, the boy was gone. The parish learned this the following morning, when the father arrived at the chapel with dirt smeared across his arms and a look in his eyes that emptied the room. He asked for help, not because he believed Etienne could be pulled back, but because no man in the parish should face what lived in the swamp alone. Search parties were formed. Men gathered their lanterns, rifles, and dogs, though the animals refused to follow. The most seasoned hunter in the group suggested leaving the dogs behind rather than forcing them into terror they did not deserve. The priest joined the searchers, carrying only a heavy wooden cross that had belonged to his predecessor. Together they entered the fog-soaked marsh, following the faint disturbances in the mud. The search revealed strange signs, half-destroyed reeds crushed under weight that shifted direction unpredictably, claw-like marks along a fallen log, splashes of something dark staining the water, though no fresh kill lay nearby. The trail wound deeper into the marsh, into land where even experienced hunters rarely went. The fog thickened until the men could barely see the ground at their feet. One hunter found the first clear indication that they were no longer searching for a boy. Near a bend in the water, he spotted a cluster of footprints. Some belonged to deer, some to raccoons, but intermingled with them were impressions that resembled a human foot, longer, heavier, distorted by pressure that made the heel sink deeper than the toes. No bare human foot made such a shape. No animal print looked so close to human. The men stood around the prints without speaking for nearly a minute, the weight of the truth settling over them like the fog itself. They continued searching, but with less hope and more dread. They knew the shape this pattern took. They had seen it only in the oldest tales, the ones retold by their grandparents, with a look of haunted caution. No one said the word Rougarou, but the silence carried it. The further the men traveled, the more the signs changed. Branches were stripped of bark in long, clean lines. Moss hung shredded from low limbs. A narrow path had been carved through thick brush as though something large had passed through without slowing. None of these signs aligned with any predator known to the region. Even the alligators, ancient rulers of the marsh, left different evidence when they fed or moved. This was something else entirely. Near midday, the trail vanished. The fog lifted slightly, revealing a patch of muddy ground undisturbed by any footprint. The trackers searched for hours, circling outward in a wide radius, but found nothing. It was as if whatever had passed through had stepped directly into the air and disappeared. The men continued searching until the sun began to lower, but as the shadows lengthened, fear overpowered their determination. They began to retreat in pairs, unwilling to be caught in the swamp at night after what they had seen. Back in town, the father waited outside his home in silence, refusing food and speaking only when necessary. The priest approached him gently, offering what comfort he could without pretending false hope. The father nodded, accepting the words but not absorbing them. He stared toward the swamp with the expression of a man awaiting a verdict. Etienne did not return that night, nor did he return the next. But on the third night, just before dawn, the hounds began to howl again. This time the sound came from the eastern side of the parish. People lit lanterns in panic, peering out from their windows. A shadow moved along the ridge between the cane fields and the water, a massive shape, low to the ground, moving with a smoothness that defied human gait. The hounds' howling sharpened into a terror none of the families had heard before. Something had come back to Bayou Piquant. Not a boy, not anymore. And the parish, trembling behind its locked doors, understood that a legend had crossed out of story and into skin. The thing that moved along the ridge that night did not rush or stumble. It did not behave like something desperate or lost. It moved with the calm certainty of a creature returning to familiar ground, as if the dark cane fields were no different from the forests its ancestors had prowled long before the first Acadians ever set foot in the marsh. What the family saw from their shuttered windows was not frantic. It was not clumsy. It was not human. The shadow traveled with the quiet authority of a predator that believed itself unchallenged. By the time dawn lightened the sky over Bayou Piquant, no one doubted that something had come back from the swamp. The fog receded the same way. A hand withdraws from a flame, curling inward and vanishing into the trees. The dogs lay exhausted beneath porches, too shaken to bark. Birds finally returned to the branches, but they perched uneasily, as if testing the air before trusting it again. The land seemed relieved to have survived the night, but the relief felt temporary, like the pause between lightning and thunder. The hunters did not wait for the priest's call. They gathered at sunrise, their faces drawn tight, their movements deliberate. This time they brought more lanterns, more rifles, and the oldest men among them who knew what little remained of the Rougarou lore. They did not speak of Etienne directly. His name had become a wound they walked around. They spoke instead of duty to the parish, to their livestock, to their families. The men understood that whatever had walked the ridge needed to be tracked before nightfall, while daylight still held dominion. They began in the place where the shadow had first appeared. The ground bore marks of passage, but not the kind any hunter preferred. Patches of flattened grass showed where something heavy had passed, yet the mud showed no clear prints. The earth looked as though weight had been applied in unpredictable intervals, deep impressions in some places, none in others, suggesting a creature that shifted its weight the way a man shifts between heel and toe. The hunters exchanged glances they did not want their sons to see. Their faces betrayed a recognition none dared admit. They had seen tracks like this only in the oldest stories, the ones whispered by firelight when children were meant to be asleep. They followed the signs into the cane fields. The stalks stood tall, sharp and crowded, forming a labyrinth where visibility shrank to mere feet. The hunters walked slowly, lanterns held low, watching the ground for any disturbance. The deeper they went, the more the signs changed. Some stalks were torn halfway, snapped at an angle that suggested immense force. Others bore long scratches running vertically, as if something with narrow, powerful claws had brushed against them while passing. Halfway through the field, they found the first undeniable evidence. A calf lay sprawled on the ground, its body stiff in an unnatural position. Its neck bore no teeth marks. Instead, the hide was peeled in 3 long strips, clean and precise. No animal native to the region killed that way. The hunters circled the calf in silence, lanterns trembling in their hands. They observed the ground. No paw prints, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. The kill carried the unmistakable signature of something that understood flesh yet stood outside the natural order. One of the oldest hunters knelt beside the calf, touching the exposed sinew with 2 fingers. He closed his eyes and inhaled. The scent clinging to the carcass sent him reeling backward. The men helped him up, and though he said nothing, his pallor revealed the truth. He recognized the smell. It was the smell described by his grandfather, a stench somewhere between wet fur, stagnant water, and a metallic tang that clung to the air long after the creature had moved on. The hunters continued. The trail led them through winding rows of cane until they reached a stretch of land where the field opened onto a marsh channel. The ground there was soft, saturated with water, the perfect place to capture a clear print. And there it was, one unmistakable impression, pressed into the mud. The shape resembled a human foot, but elongated, with the arch stretched unnaturally and the pressure point deepened at the front, as if weight had shifted forward rather than back. The toes were tapered, almost claw-like. Every man present knew what he was seeing, yet wished he did not. A footprint halfway between man and beast, the kind their ancestors had described during long winters in French territory, the kind that had followed them across an ocean and settled into the folklore of the swamp. They returned home with more questions than answers. The priest listened to their findings and closed his eyes long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. He knew the next step, though no one wanted to say it aloud. If the creature that walked the ridge was truly a Rougarou, not metaphor, not symbol, not warning but living flesh, then the parish faced a danger older than any prayer could tame. The lore was contradictory. Some versions insisted the Rougarou avoided harming humans unless provoked. Others claimed it fed on disobedience, targeting those who broke promises or encouraged others to stray. Still others described the creature as consumed by hunger, attacking anything living when the curse reached full strength. But every version agreed on one thing. Once the transformation began, there was no turning back until the cycle finished 101 nights of altered skin, before the body either returned to its human shape or succumbed entirely to the beast. That night, the parish did not sleep. Lanterns burned in every window. Men sat awake with rifles across their knees. Mothers kept their children close. Even the wind avoided moving through the cane, leaving the fields unnaturally still. The moon rose thin and sharp, its pale light sliding across the marsh like a blade. Just before midnight, the quiet broke. It began with a scream so distant that families thought they had imagined it. A long, low cry echoed across the water, not the voice of any animal known to the parish. It carried the structure of human pain twisted into something older, more primitive. Dogs tucked their tails and slunk beneath porches. Horses kicked inside their stalls. The families who lived closest to the marsh clutched the arms of their chairs, listening as the sound repeated, each time closer, each time more distorted. Then came the second noise, a deep, guttural roar that sounded as if forced up from the ground rather than expelled from a throat. Windows shook, lamps flickered. Even the crickets ceased their rhythm. People who had faced hurricanes without blinking found themselves trembling. One family, the Doucettes, lived near the center of the parish. Their eldest son, Marcel, had left earlier that night to check the fishing lines along the marsh channel. He had promised he would return before moonrise, but as the parish listened to the night tear open with those sounds, his mother sat beside the door with her hands pressed. Together, fearing what silence might bring. The hunters were already gathering before the scream finished echoing. They lit lanterns, loaded their rifles, and met at the edge of the main road. Fear hung thick in the air. But these men had grown up in a parish where courage was not an option but a necessity. They walked in a tight formation toward the marsh, lanterns forming a trembling chain of light. The scent hit them first, an overpowering mixture of mud, iron, and the musk of something wild. It clung to the air with a thickness that felt alive. The hunters moved cautiously, stepping around pools of water and thick patches of moss. The fog did not return that night, but the darkness felt deeper than usual, swallowing the light of their lanterns more quickly than it should have. The first lantern beam caught sight of something ahead. A figure lay slumped on the ground, half hidden by reeds. As the hunters approached, they recognized Marcel Doucet. His clothes were torn, his skin sliced with long, narrow gouges running from shoulder to rib. He still breathed, but his breaths were shallow and irregular. His eyes stared upward, fixed on a part of the sky the others could not interpret. His lips moved, forming silent shapes, but no sound emerged. The priest knelt beside him, pressing one hand over the boy's chest, as if trying to hold his soul in place. Marcel's pulse fluttered weakly beneath his ribs. His fingertips were curled inward, stiffening. The hunters prepared to lift him when one of them pointed to the ground beside the reeds. There, pressed clearly into the mud, was another footprint, the same elongated, heavy impression they had seen earlier in the day. But this print was deeper, as if the creature had paused and put its full weight into the step. And directly beside it, overlapping the edge, was a trail of fresh blood. The hunters scanned the darkness. Lantern light trembled across the tree line. They listened. At first, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere deeper in the marsh, a low, resonant breath drifted toward them. Not a growl, not a snarl, a breath. Slow, deliberate, steady. It was the sound of something watching them from the dark. The hunters pulled back, knowing they could not risk carrying Marcel home if the creature sought to finish what it had started. Two men kept their rifles trained on the marsh while the others lifted the injured boy. They retreated carefully, never turning their backs fully until the lights of the parish appeared through the trees. Marcel survived the journey home, but he never recovered entirely. His wounds healed into long, ridged scars that pulsed faintly in humid weather. His mind remained fractured, lost in the space between memory and nightmare. The first thing he did upon waking was refuse to sleep without a lantern burning. The second thing he did was beg his family not to let him near the marsh again. Word spread fast. The swamp had claimed its first victim, not killed but marked, shredded, changed. The elders understood what this meant. The curse inside Etienne had reached its first breaking point. The creature walking in his skin had tasted human fear. Whether it was the influence of the Catholic curse or the hunger of the beast, the result was the same. Bayou Piquant was no longer dealing with rumor or shadow. The Rougarou was not passing through. It had claimed territory. And once a Rougarou claimed a parish, it did not leave until the cycle finished, or until every barrier, faith, courage, blood, prayer, was broken. The first killing moon had risen, and it would not be the last. The injury to Marcel Doucet did more than frighten the parish. It broke the fragile boundary between superstition and certainty. Before that night, people could still pretend the disturbances were caused by weather, or hogs gone wild, or tricks of exhaustion. After Marcel's blood stained the reeds, no amount of rational explanation could keep the truth from settling over Bayou Piquant like a second skin. Something had stepped out of the stories and into the parish, and it walked with the hunger of a curse given flesh. The hunters convened the morning after the attack, gathering in the clearing near the church, while the sun still struggled to cut through the haze. Men who rarely shared more than brief greetings now stood in tight circles, speaking in low, urgent tones. The fear that hung in the air did not resemble panic. It resembled resolve, heavy and solemn. This was not a problem they could hand to the priest alone. This was not something that a sermon could scatter. This was a threat that required the same kind of collective action their ancestors had used when storms tore houses from pilings and drove the water up past the cane. Every man present knew what their forefathers had passed down. If a Rougarou rooted itself in a parish, it would not leave of its own will. The curse ran its path like fire running the length of a fuse. Once lit, it moved, forward without mercy. Some tales said the transformation grew more violent with each cycle. Others said the creature's hunger intensified until it fed on instinct alone. The elders who remembered their grandparents' stories believed the truth lay somewhere in the middle. The creature hunted because it needed to, and the curse punished because someone had failed to keep a promise. Etienne's father stood among the hunters, his face ashen, his shoulders squared not with pride but with the weight of responsibility. He did not ask the men to spare his son. He did not plead for mercy. He simply acknowledged that something beyond Etienne's will had taken hold, and that the safety of the parish outweighed any father's longing to reclaim the boy he once knew. The men understood his silence. They respected it. and they carried it with them as they prepared for what lay ahead. The priest joined them, though his presence served a different purpose. He carried no weapon, only his cross, the heavy wooden one with edges smoothed by generations of hands. He knew the church's teachings offered no clear path through the territory of curses older than Scripture, but he also knew that the parish needed the symbol of faith to anchor its courage. Even the oldest hunters, men who trusted the swamp more than the saints, accepted his presence as part of the necessary balance between the physical and the spiritual. Their plan formed slowly, shaped by caution, instinct, and the old ways. The hunters would track the creature at dusk, following the pattern it had shown the previous night. The beast moved in cycles, each pass taking it deeper into the territory surrounding the cane fields. If they could intercept its path between marsh and ridge, they might contain it long enough to drive it toward a trap. No one pretended the trap would kill it outright. The older lore claimed that physical weapons could wound a Rougarou, but not destroy it. The men simply hoped to weaken the creature long enough to prevent another attack. Word spread quickly. Families secured their homes, layered windows with thick boards, and kept lanterns burning in each room. Children were not allowed outside even in daylight. Livestock was brought indoors or penned close to the center of the parish. The land itself seemed to sense the preparations. The wind stilled. The water grew flat and silent. The afternoon sun glowed redder than usual, staining the sky with an uneasy dusk long before nightfall. As evening approached, the hunters gathered once more at the edge of the cane. They carried lanterns, ropes, nets woven with thick hemp, and the heaviest firearms available. The older men moved with deliberate slowness, muttering instructions to the younger ones, reminding them of the old methods. The younger men listened, their hands trembling despite their attempts to appear steady. The first sign of the creature's approach came in the form of sound, a low vibration, almost too subtle to notice at first, rolled across the field. It was not the growl of a gator or the cry of a wildcat. It resembled a distorted exhale, as if the land itself breathed out under a great weight. The hunters stiffened. The priest clutched the cross tighter. The first lantern near the front flickered. Then came the shift in the cane. Something moved through the stalks with fluid, deliberate steps, bending the rows in a pattern too large and too controlled to measure. Lantern light caught brief flashes between the columns of green, a shadow passing low, then rising higher, then dropping again. The hunters steadied their grips. A few of the men positioned near the back muttered prayers under their breath, old Cajun invocations woven from French and fear. The creature did not rush toward them. It circled instead, as if testing the perimeter of their gathering. It moved quickly, but without the frantic chaos of an animal cornered. It behaved like something that understood strategy, as though deciding which man to strike first. The hunters shifted their formation, tightening their circle. Etienne's father stood near the center. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. He kept his gaze fixed on the perimeter, determined not to flinch, determined not to fail the boy who no longer belonged to him. The creature revealed itself in fragments before its full form emerged. First came the sound of heavy breathing, deeper than any human breath, yet patterned enough to mimic one. Then came the rustle of leaves and the creak of shifting stalks. Lantern light caught a flash of something dark, fur or skin, no one could tell. Then a shape passed between two narrow rows, the darkness swallowing its outline. Finally, in a small clearing at the center of the field, the creature stepped into full view. It stood hunched, its limbs too long for its body, its spine arched in a way that suggested both pain and power. The shape resembled a man, from a distance but warped in ways that defied anatomy. The torso carried the mass of a human, but the limbs twisted into angles that suggested a beast's leverage. The head remained lowered, obscured by shadow, yet the outline betrayed something elongated. It breathed with a sound that rattled the cane. The Rougarou had taken Etienne's shape, but it had remade him into something that belonged to the swamp more than to flesh. The hunters froze. Not one man moved. Not one dared to break the tension. For a moment, the creature remained still as well, as if assessing its audience. The priest lifted the cross. The creature's shoulders shuddered, not in retreat but in irritation, as though the symbol struck a nerve deeper than the body itself. The first attack came fast. The creature lunged sideways, not toward the center of the circle as the men had expected, but toward the weakest point near the back. It moved with the uncanny speed of something freed from the constraints of human limbs. Lanterns flew from hands. Rifles shifted too slow. The creature slammed into one of the younger hunters, knocking him backward into the grass. The men reacted instantly, pulling the injured hunter back and forming a tighter line. The creature withdrew just as quickly, retreating into the cane with fluid motion, leaving behind only a trail of bent stalks. The hunters fired into the dark, but the shots echoed without landing. The priest shouted instructions, trying to steady the men's resolve, though his own breath faltered with each passing moment. The creature attacked again, this time from the left. It emerged low to the ground, nearly crawling, its limbs striking with accuracy. The hunters swung their lanterns to meet it, the sudden flare of light startling the creature long enough for them to thrust their nets forward. The hemp tangled around the creature's limbs, tightening as the men pulled with all their strength. For a brief moment, they had it. The creature fought, the net with violent thrashing, its muscles bunching beneath the twisted skin. The hunters strained to hold it, feet digging into the earth. The priest stepped forward, cross raised, his voice steady despite the chaos. But the Rougarou did not yield. With a surge of strength, it tore one limb free of the net, then another. The hemp snapped, fibers whipping into the air. The creature rose in a single fluid motion, lifting its head for the first time. The lantern light caught its face. It bore some faint, horrifying trace of Etienne, the shape of the brow, the angle of the cheek. But the eyes were not his. They glowed with a molten, unnatural reflection, like metal heated beyond its threshold. The jaw hung too wide, stretched by a force that had twisted the mouth into a snarl that held no memory of speech. The creature roared a sound that shook the hunters to their core. It was a sound of fury, hunger, and something else, something wounded. The hunters staggered. The priest faltered. The creature used the opening to strike. It moved through the circle like a blade through reeds. Lanterns shattered, nets tore. The hunters swung their rifles like clubs, but the creature anticipated each strike. It knocked men aside with the force of a body propelled by two natures, one human, one ancient. The father managed to reach the creature, swinging the butt of his rifle into its shoulder. The impact barely slowed it. For a moment, the creature turned and faced him directly. A flicker of recognition, or something close to it, passed across its distorted features. The father stared back, unflinching, as if daring his son to resurface. Then, the moment ended. The creature knocked the rifle away and disappeared into the cane with a force that rattled the entire field. The hunters regrouped, breathless and shaken. The priest steadied his grip on the cross. The father stood trembling, not from fear but from the collision of love and horror. They had faced the creature, and it had survived without injury. The hunters understood the truth that night. The Rougarou could not be fought like a beast. It could not be killed like a man. It carried both the curse of faith and the hunger of the swamp, woven into a form that refused to die until its cycle finished. Bayou Piquant was running out of time, and the creature walking in Etienne's skin had only grown stronger. The parish of Bayou Piquant moved into the final stretch of Lent with a kind of dread usually reserved for approaching hurricanes. People no longer spoke of Etienne as missing. They spoke of him the way older generations spoke of storms and sickness events that arrived without warning and left ruin behind. The boy they had known had become something else, something shaped by guilt, hunger, and forces older than any human authority. And though the hunters had survived the encounter in the cane, the parish understood that the creature had not fought at full strength. It had tested them, measuring their resolve, learning the rhythm of their fear. The days following the failed hunt unfolded in a strange pattern. The swamp grew restless in the afternoons but fell silent before dusk, as if preparing for the creature's nightly circuit. Families no longer attempted chores after sunset. Doors were barred early. Fathers sat awake long into the night with lanterns burning low, listening for the faintest sound outside. Mothers braided charms into their children's hair, old protective knots carried from France, and placed bowls of blessed water under windowsills. Even the skeptics participated in these rituals, unwilling to risk irreverence when the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The priest conducted extra services each morning, his voice hoarse yet steady. He offered blessings with a fervor that bordered on desperation. He urged confession, even from those who had nothing to confess. He paced the aisles with a heaviness in his footsteps, as though each prayer he carried weighed more than the one before. He knew what the parish faced. He had read the old records stored in the rectory papers, so brittle that they threatened to crumble at each turn. Those records described other seasons when a broken vow had given rise to a creature that stalked the marsh for 101 nights. Those stories never ended cleanly. They ended with wounds, with disappearances, with parishes that needed years to recover. Etienne's father became a ghost among the living. He moved through the parish with the slow, deliberate steps of a man urging his body to keep going when his spirit had already cracked. He accepted food reluctantly, spoke sparingly, and avoided gatherings unless summoned. The other men treated him with quiet dignity, knowing that the grief he carried was uniquely cruel, a grief for a son still alive but stolen. He spent long hours standing at the boundary of his yard, staring into the swamp, hoping for a glimpse of the boy he had raised. Yet each night, the only movement he saw belonged to the fog. On the fourth night after the failed hunt, the creature returned to the parish's outer boundary. This time it did not attack. It prowled. It circled. It moved along the edges of the cane fields with calm calculation, leaving behind deep impressions in the mud that suggested an increase in its strength. The hunters observed these tracks at dawn and understood their meaning. The creature was changing. Its body was adapting to the curse, shedding the last remnants of the boy's limitations. Where once it had moved with the irregular gait of a form caught between two shapes, now it moved with the confidence of something that understood its dominion. The attacks resumed slowly. Livestock vanished from the farthest properties. A pair of horses was found trembling behind a collapsed barn door, their hides streaked with long, narrow scratches. One night, two fishermen working past dusk reported seeing something large swimming through the marsh channel. They described a trail of ripples far wider than any gator, moving in a straight line with unnatural speed. They left their nets behind and fled back to town. The parish grew smaller in spirit. Even the children sensed the dread. They stopped playing near the water, stopped chasing each other along the docks, stopped leaving the safety of the porches unless accompanied by adults. Their eyes carried the same wide, quiet fear the adults tried to hide. At night, the sound of their mothers softly singing to keep them calm drifted through the parish like a river of frayed hope. The swamp responded to the growing presence of the creature. Trees that once swayed with the breeze now stood rigid, their branches twisted into unnatural stillness. The water thickened, as if burdened by something rising beneath the surface. The air carried the metallic smell that came each time the creature moved through the marsh. Even the moon seemed affected, casting a pale, sickly light that turned the land into an unwelcoming theater. On the sixth night, the parish suffered its first fatality. A fisherman named Auguste Broussard failed to return home from checking his traps along the northern channel. When searchers found his boat at dawn, it floated empty, bumping softly against the marsh grass. The hull carried long gouges along one side, carved deep enough to expose raw wood. The bottom of the boat was flooded with water tinted rust red. The men who discovered it stood silent for a long time, each understanding that to linger any longer would be to invite the same fate. They tied the boat and dragged it back to the parish, their faces grim and heavy. Auguste's widow did not scream. She accepted the news with the restraint of someone who had feared this outcome since the curse began. She closed the shutters of her home and lit 3 candles, one for her husband, one for her children, and one for the boy who had become the source of the parish's suffering. She prayed for all of them without distinction. The death marked a turning point. The creature was no longer content to circle the parish. It had crossed from threat to action. The fear thickened. People stopped sleeping. Lanterns burned until dawn. And the hunters met daily to strategize, their nerves fraying under the pressure of a danger that refused to stay still. The priest urged the men to focus on the remaining days of Lent. According to the oldest stories, the curse peaked during the final week, when faith wavered under the weight of exhaustion. If Etienne's vow had triggered the curse, then Easter might provide an opening, either to weaken the creature or to force it from its path. The priest admitted this was speculation, but it was the closest thing to strategy the parish possessed. The hunters listened, but relied more on their instincts. They spent the afternoons patrolling the outer edges of the parish, marking any signs that the creature had approached. They secured the livestock more heavily. They constructed makeshift barricades near the cane fields. The older hunters taught the younger ones how to move quietly through the marsh, how to avoid areas where the mud grew too deep to escape quickly. They passed down knowledge that had lain dormant for generations, the old methods of navigating a swamp when a curse traveled through it. Etienne's father refused to join the patrols. He insisted on searching alone, certain that the creature would respond differently to him. Some tried to stop him. Most understood that trying to restrain a grieving man was an act neither compassion nor common sense could justify. He wandered the boundaries of the parish each night, lantern in hand, not out of hope, but out of necessity. He wanted the creature to know he was not hiding. He wanted it to recognize him if any part of Etienne remained inside that twisted frame. On the 7th night, something shifted. The fog rose earlier, thicker than it had since the night Etienne vanished. It crawled through the cane, crept up the docks, curled beneath the houses, and rolled into the center of the parish. Families reacted instantly, securing doors and windows, gathering children, and extinguishing lights. They recognized this fog. It was the same that had covered the parish the night Etienne's transformation began. The hunters took their positions near the ridge, lanterns dimmed, and rifles readied. The priest joined them, despite their protests. He stood at the front of the group, cross held firmly, his eyes fixed on the tree line. The creature emerged slowly from the fog, its silhouette taller and broader than it had been during the earlier encounters. The transformation had advanced. Its limbs moved with seamless coordination. Its posture suggested a union between human and beast, rather than a struggle. The glow in its eyes burned brighter, illuminating the fog around it like two embers. The hunters felt their breath tighten. The creature did not charge. It advanced at a steady pace, each step sinking briefly into the mud before rising again. The motion reminded the hunters of the way a man stalks prey, deliberate, silent, patient. Etienne's father stepped forward. The hunters bristled, but none restrained him. This confrontation had hovered in the air for days, the inevitable moment when father and son would meet in the half-light of the creature's transformation. The priest remained still, understanding that this moment belonged to neither faith nor reason, but to something older than both. The creature stopped 5 paces from the father. The fog swirled between them. The father stared at the distorted shape, searching for anything familiar. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind the creature's eyes. Recognition, pain, conflict. Then the flicker vanished. The creature's frame tightened, its muscles coiled, its breath deepened. The hunters stepped forward, beginning to raise their weapons. Before they could act, the creature retreated into the fog, slipping away with unnerving speed. It disappeared so quickly that the hunters could not track its direction. The father reached out instinctively, but the beast was already gone. The hunters regrouped, shaken. They realized the creature had not retreated out of fear. It had withdrawn because it had seen something in the father it did not understand, something that pressed against whatever remained of the boy buried inside the curse. For the first time since the transformation began, the creature hesitated. This hesitation meant one thing. There was still a sliver of Etienne inside the beast, and slivers have a way of breaking open when the right moment comes. The parish clung to that fragile truth as the final days of Lent approached. They did not know if it would save them, but they knew it would decide everything. The final nights of Lent descended over Bayou Piquant with a weight that felt older than Scripture. The parish had grown, accustomed to living in a state of quiet dread, yet the air during that last week seemed charged with something deeper than fear. It carried the pressure of conclusion, the knowledge that the curse had nearly completed its cycle, and whatever outcome the creature hunted would be decided before Easter dawn. People spoke less. They prayed more. Lanterns burned shorter each day as supplies dwindled, yet no one dared let their lights go out prematurely. The swamp changed again in ways subtle but unmistakable. The reeds trembled even on windless days, as if stirred from below rather than from above. The marsh channels pulsed outward in sudden bursts. circles widening across the water without any visible cause. The animals sensed the tension and avoided the usual paths. Even the alligators, which did not fear much, remained in deeper waters, their eyes flicking nervously toward the banks whenever the fog thickened. The swamp behaved like a living witness to the curse's final act. Inside the parish homes, families clung to ritual. Mothers placed sprigs of rosemary under pillows. Fathers salted doorways. Children hid behind their elders, sensing a conclusion they could not understand. Even the skeptics felt the inevitability pressing in. A curse does not drift into nothing. It ends with a reckoning, and Bayou Piquant had learned the hard way that reckoning would not come quietly. The hunters met nightly in the same clearing near the church, reviewing the creature's patterns. It had begun circling closer to the heart of the parish instead of retreating to the outer marsh. The shift in territory meant the creature was either growing bolder or weakening. No one could decide which idea frightened them more. The father attended each meeting, silent and steady, leaning on the weight of his grief as though it anchored him. He watched the maps drawn in dirt, studied the patterns of broken vegetation, and listened to the reports of distant sightings. Not once did he suggest harming the creature. He did not need to. The hunters already knew what was required. The priest brought old records to the final meeting, parchment pages marked with fading ink. They documented the last time a Rougarou had emerged in their region nearly a century prior. According to the accounts, the curse ended abruptly on the final night of Lent. The creature's strength surged at dusk, then shifted rapidly toward collapse as dawn approached. By sunrise, the beast either vanished or reverted. No one had ever recorded the exact details. The witnesses never spoke of what the dawn revealed. The absence of detail was its own warning. The priest read these accounts with the gravity of someone carrying the weight of 200 souls. He reminded the hunters that the curse fed on human weakness but bound itself to a cycle older than the parish. Easter represented both mercy and judgment. It was the moment when transformation could be undone or sealed. The hunters nodded, understanding the implications. The final night would bring resolution. It would also bring danger unlike anything they had faced before. On the eve of Easter, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. It did not unleash rain or lightning. Instead, it delivered a pressure that crushed the air flat against the land. The fog rose earlier than usual. Its density changed from white to a sickly gray that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The swamp exhaled a long, slow breath that reached the parish like a warning whispered through the reeds. The hunters gathered along the ridge, lanterns dimmed. They carried ropes, nets, and the heaviest firearms they owned, though they knew weapons alone would not determine the night's outcome. The priest stood with them, cross raised, the symbol steady but the hand trembling slightly. The father positioned himself near the front, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the direction where the creature typically appeared. He had not slept in days, yet he stood stronger than any man present. His grief had transformed into purpose. The fog parted. The creature emerged with a presence that forced every hunter to take a step back. Its body had grown impossibly large. Its silhouette towered over the cane, the limbs elongated, the shoulders broad. The transformation had reached its brutal peak. This was no longer the half-formed creature they had encountered before. This was the full expression of the curse's hunger. A beast molded by broken promises and ancient fear. It moved slowly, not with hesitation but with controlled power. Each step pressed deep into the earth, sending vibrations through the ground. The hunters held their positions, rifles raised but fingers unsteady. No one wanted to fire. They understood the cost, but they also understood the danger of letting the creature advance unchecked. The father stepped forward. The hunters parted to let him pass. His movements were deliberate. His face held no fear. He walked as a man who had already accepted the outcome, whatever it might be. He stopped within 10 paces of the creature. The fog swirled between them like smoke rising from a dying ember. The creature paused, its posture shifting subtly, as though some fragment of memory rippled through its twisted frame. For a moment, the world stilled. The father raised a hand, not to defend or challenge, but to bridge the distance between what had been lost and what remained. The creature trembled. Its breath faltered. The hunters felt the shift. subtle yet undeniable. Something inside the beast fought against the curse's final grip. Something remembered. The priest stepped forward, lifting the cross higher. The hunters tensed. The creature's muscles coiled. The air thickened. Then the moment shattered. A sound tore through the swamp, a guttural cry that carried equal parts agony and rage. The creature reared back, its entire frame contorting. The glow in its eyes flickered violently. The transformation pushed toward its breaking point, writhing under the pressure of conflicting forces. The curse wanted to complete itself. The boy buried within wanted release. The hunters advanced with nets and ropes, trying to restrain the creature. The beast lashed out with terrifying force, knocking men aside with the sweep of its limbs. The priest maintained his stance, refusing to back away even as debris flew through the air. The father remained closest, refusing to break eye contact with the distorted face that still carried fragments of the son he had raised. The creature lunged. The father braced for impact, but did not flinch. The beast collided with him, driving him to the ground. The hunters screamed and surged forward, but the father raised a trembling hand, signaling them to stop. The creature hovered above him, breath ragged, jaws trembling. The father reached upward, placing his palm gently on the creature's chest. The beast froze. The parish held its breath, something deep within. The creature's body convulsed, its limbs jerked. The roar that escaped it sounded less like fury and more like a soul cracking open. The transformation began to reverse, not cleanly, not gently, but violently. Bones shifted, muscles contracted. The silhouette shrank, folding in on itself with grotesque distortion. The creature collapsed onto the ground, thrashing as the curse tore itself free, leaving behind the ravaged outline of a boy who had endured too much. The hunters approached cautiously. The priest knelt, placing the cross against the boy's forehead. The father crawled to his son's side, gathering him into his arms. The boy's breathing came in shallow gasps, each more fragile than the last. His body trembled with aftershocks of the transformation. The father held him close, whispering words that could not be heard but carried the weight of forgiveness. The boy's shaking slowed, his breath quieted. His chest rose one final time, then stilled. The father bowed his head over the body, rocking slightly as the swamp released a long, solemn exhale. The hunters lowered their weapons. The priest closed his eyes. The fog lifted, drifting upward into the trees like a soul ascending. Morning crept over the parish slowly, washing the land in pale gold. Easter dawn arrived, not with celebration but with silence. The curse was broken. The Rougarou had completed its cycle. Yet the price had been steep, a family shattered, a parish forever marked, a legend renewed with fresh memory. The hunters carried the boy's body back to the parish. The father walked at the front, his face carved from grief and resolve. The priest followed behind, reciting prayers beneath his breath. Villagers gathered quietly as the procession passed, each understanding that what they witnessed would be retold for generations, not as a tale meant to frighten children, but as a truth carried in the marrow of the land. They buried Etienne at the edge of the parish, near the water he had grown up on. The father placed a small wooden carving at the grave, a simple figure shaped like a wolf. The symbol honored both the boy he had been and the creature he had become. It was neither condemnation nor absolution. It was acknowledgement. The swamp returned to its natural rhythm in the days that followed. The fog lifted earlier. The animals resumed their patterns. The water lost its metallic scent. The parish breathed again. Yet everyone knew the land had absorbed the story, adding it to the long line of legends that shaped its identity. Some said they heard distant howls during the next full moon. Others claimed the boy's spirit walked the marsh, neither beast nor human, serving as a quiet guardian against future curses. Whatever the truth, Bayou Piquant understood one thing clearly. The Rougarou was not a myth. It was a promise, a reminder that the line between sin and suffering is thin, a warning that the swamp never forgets broken vows, and a testament to the fact that some stories walk on two legs long before they crawl across the tongue. The parish slept easier, but never fully. Because once a Rougarou has walked your land, the soil remembers the weight of its steps, and the land of the south, wet, wild, unforgiving, never lets memory die.